Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 7 Cognition, Part 2 Forming Memories. So, we're going to get into talking about the three stages of memory: the sensory memory, the working memory, sometimes known as short term memory, and long term memory. And so, how do we form memories? Well, sensory memory, this is the first of the three stages that we're going to talk about. Um, this is all about preserving a brief sensory impression of a stimuli. So most of these, impressions are very fleeting of all the three stages because it typically holds sights, sounds, smells, textures, and other sensory impressions for just a fraction of a second, meaning that it's here and gone. If we could remember every sensory impulse that we had, we probably would be so burdened down with so much information that we would probably um, kind of be on the edge as far as having some mental issues. The second stage is sometimes known as short term memory, but your book refers to it as working memory. And this is one of the most limited forms of memory because of its capacity size. It preserves recently perceived events and experiences for less than a minute without rehearsal. It takes information for the most part from sensory memory and registers and connects it with items that are already in our long term storage. The number is kind of important here because typically our working or short term memory is limited to about 7 items, give or take, a couple on either side. So if you think about it, telephone numbers have a tendency to be about 7 digits long, if you're not including like an area code. And there's a reason for that because anything longer than that, we have a hard time recalling it at a later date. The final one is your long term memory. This is the largest as far as capacity and the longest as far as duration, meaning that if we get this information from sensory and working memory into the long term memory, we're probably going to be able to retrieve it at a later date. Long term memory stores materials organized according to their meaning. And how we organize that might vary from person to person, but long term memory holds each person's total knowledge of the world and of yourself. So, if you take a look at this, we mentioned a little bit before talking about encoding, storage, and retrieval. These are all important when it comes to the beginnings of memory. But talking about sensory memory and short term or working memory, as far as the capacities and how that gets moved into long term memory for hopefully the ability to retrieve, all this is vital to the whole process of cognition. So, the structure and function of sensory memory, there is a separate sensory register for each sense. The register for vision is called the iconic memory, and it stores encoded light patterns that we see as visual images. Sensory memory for hearing is also known as iconic memory. So you're thinking about encoding auditory sensory stimuli. This is kind of like an echo in a sense. The biological basis for sensory memory for the most part, memory images take the form of nerve impulses in the sense organs and their pathways to the brain. And sensory memory consists merely of rapid fading traces of stimulation. Working memory reads these fading traces and decides which information um, that they can admit into the spotlight of attention, to which items we're going to ignore and allow to disappear. So we can't remember it all. Some of it we do want to recall. Some of it we're just going to allow to fade away. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of test some of the sensory memory. And I'm going to show you a slide here for about a second. And your job here is to try to recall as many letters as you possibly can. So here we go. Okay. So how many of these items can you recall? And I will take a few moments to think about this. we're going to take a look and see what you can recall here. So, if you didn't pause to kind of recall here, and if you still want to try to recall, you can hit the pause button. Otherwise, I'm going to show you what we've got here. So here we go. So these are the letters. Now that you can take a look at these a little longer, how many of them could you recall? Well, it all varies from person to person. A lot of times we might pick up one or two. Sometimes we can pick up a lot more than what we know. But the deal is, unless we're going to, you know, kind of want to retrieve this at a later time, we have to rehearse it so we can get it into working memory. So, working memory is where you process conscious experiences. And working memory is that mechanism that selects information from the sensory memory. Working memory also provides a mental workspace where we sort encoded information before adding it to our long-term storage. One of the things that people kind of use as an analogy is that your working memory is like a central processing chip. If you think about like processors in a computer, in a sense, it typically holds information for roughly 20 seconds. For the longer 20 seconds longer than our sensory memory does. And if you make a special effort to rehearse, meaning like the repeating of a phone number perhaps, the material can we can keep that information active longer, and hence possibly getting that to our long-term storage. Anyway, this process is for the most part called thinking. The capacity and duration of working memory or short-term memory. Working memory holds roughly 7 items, give or take 2 items either side of that. This is a fact that has caused a lot of complaints when phone companies have required callers to add area codes to the old 7-digit phone number. The capacity does vary slightly from person to person and probably from task to task. There are times when, if it's a very simple list of things to remember, you might remember more than 7. But if it's a complicated series of items that you have to, be able to retrieve, it might be 5. So when we overload the working memory, earlier items are usually lost to accommodate for the more recent ones. And this is why it's dangerous to talk on a cell phone or a smartphone when you're driving, because we have a tendency to kind of lose our attention there. Working memory storage capacity is significantly smaller than our sensory memory, which seems kind of odd, but it's true. Working memory has the smallest capacity of all 3 memory stages, and we have the tendency to discard the information after about 20 seconds. If we're not rehearsing it, it's going to be gone. So the structure and function of working memory, we have what we call an central executive, which kind of directs attention to material retrieved for long-term memory, or to the important input from long-term memories, such as someone calling a person by a name. The second component consists of the phonological. In other words, this is the temporary stores of sounds helping us to remember the mental echo of a name. So, like if you're being introduced to a new person and they say their name, maybe the best thing that you can do in your mind is to try to say it to yourself. Otherwise, trying to remember like the melody of a song after you've just heard a brand new song, maybe on the radio, and trying to recall it, that's kind of the phonological part of it. And then the third is the sketch pad. This is used to store and manipulate visual images, as when you are imagining a route between your home and your school. One of the things I always try to think about is like, if you were trying to, in your mind, figure out how many doors are in our school, and thinking about, taking kind of that cognitive map around the building and trying to think, okay, there's a door here or there. You're using that sketch pad to kind of figure out the route. So the twin limitations of working memory, one is the limited capacity. You can only hold so much. And the other is the short duration. You're pressed for time here. If something's going to be moved into long-term memory, it's got to stick around longer than 20 to 30 seconds. So the role of rehearsal. This is going to help things stick and maybe get into long-term memory, but it's the idea to keep a memory alive and working memory. You probably repeat the information to yourself over and over. And this technique is called maintenance rehearsal. And it serves well for maintaining information temporarily in the working memory. The maintenance rehearsal, this is a working memory process in which information is merely repeated or reviewed to keep it from fading while in a working memory. And maintenance rehearsal really involves no active elaboration. In other words, you're not connecting it to things that you already know. If you would make the connection, there's a greater chance that you're going to be able to retrieve that information. So it's not as efficient as far as a way of transferring information to long term memory, although it is a strategy commonly used for this purpose by people who don't know how memory operates. And hence, when people are cramming for a test, they have a tendency to use maintenance rehearsal. Unfortunately, after the test, you're probably not going to be able to retrieve that information as easily. So, a better strategy for getting information into long term memory involves elaborate rehearsal. Okay, this method of basically information is not merely repeated, but it's actively connected to the things that we already have in our storage. Elaborate rehearsal, working memory process in which information is actively reviewed and related to information. Anyway, elaborate rehearsal, an example of this is using a number that makes use of letters on a phone buttons. So if you wanted to remember your eye doctor's number, you might use something like this: 1-800-eye-exam. And by connecting it, this might make it easier for you to remember that number and to call it when you need it. Acoustic encoding in phonological loops. Words like pop and cuckoo. Um, a person can hear them in their mind and the sound is described. So it kind of sounds like it sounds. Anyway, even with working memory, as it converts them into sounds of spoken language in its phonological loop, here in verbal patterns and working memory acquire an acoustic sound form, whether they come from or come through our eyes or through our ears. So you can look at the word pop and you kind of know kind of what that sounds like. Anyway, mistakes aside, however, acoustic encoding does have an advantage. Specifically, it seems to have a role in learning and using language. So when you're trying to learn a foreign language, probably the best way to learn it is to speak it. So acoustic encoding, this is the conversion of information, especially somatic information, to sound patterns and working memory. Visual and spatial encoding, this is your sketchpad. In working memory encodes visual images and mental representations of objects in space. Neurological evidence suggests that sketchpad involves coordination of several brain systems, including the frontal and occipital lobes, while the phonological loops, for the most part, are using the temporal lobes. One thing I should mention about Sketchpad, there's a whole movement in the world of education when you talk about note taking called sketch notes. And this other, rather than writing down the words for all the notes that you need to take in a particular class, that you are using things like images to kind of relate. And in a way, it's a different way to encode. And if a person is kind of a visual learner to begin with, this actually might have some advantages. All right, levels of processing working memory. The more connections that you can make with new information while it's in working memory, the more likely you're going to remember it later. And this requires an interaction between working memory and the long-term memory. And according to the levels of processing theory that was proposed by Ferns, Craik, and Robert Lockhart, the deeper processing establishes more connections with the long-term memories, makes new information more meaningful and more memorable. The levels of processing theory, the explanation for the fact that information that is more thoroughly connected uh, to meaningful items in long-term memory, meaning that it's more deeply processed, it will be remembered better. So, if you're trying to like, learn all your states, hooking this up maybe to a song might be one way to do it. And if you're singing a song, if there's like some kind of choreography or hand motions that go with that, there's probably a better chance that you're going to remember all those states in alphabetical order. So, the biological basis of working memory probably holds information actively firing in our nerve circuits. Brain imaging studies suggest a likely location for short term circuits is in the frontal cortex. That's the region that are active across a variety of working memory tasks. And working memory circuits have a connection with all sensory parts of the brain to the areas known to be involved in long term storage. So it's not just the hippocampus, in other words. Research also suggests that the frontal region house some executive processes that are involved in focusing attention and thinking about information in the short term memory. In other words, a lot of our organizational abilities is found in that frontal lobe. The last area, the third stage, long-term memory. Words and concepts are encoded by their meanings, which interconnect them to other items that have similar meanings. Accordingly, you might picture long-term memory as a huge web of interconnected associations. The result is a good retrieval cues such as stimuli that prompts the activation of the long-term memory. These things can help us locate the items that you want amid all the data that's stored there. You think about long-term memory, maybe like a filing system that you might have for a filing cabinet, or maybe even for the files that are in certain folders on a computer. The capacity and duration of long-term memory. Well, the capacity of long-term memory is to store all those experiences, events, information, emotion, skills, word categories, rules, judgments, you name it, it's supposedly going to be in that long-term memory. Anyway, long-term memory is potentially capable of storing information really for a lifetime, which makes long-term memory obviously the champ when it comes to both duration and capacity. The metaphor of long-term memory being kind of like a computer hard drive, might be a little misleading. Long-term memory is a sort of mental scaffold, like a scaffolding. Um, so the more associations that we make to that information, the easier it is for us to hold on to and probably to retrieve when we want it. So the structure and function of long-term memory, procedural memory, this is basically our memory for how things are done. So mental directions or procedures, how things are done, are stored within this memory. So things like skills of like how to ride a bike, tie your shoes, playing maybe a musical instrument, you name it, that's a procedural thing. Okay, declarative memory is a division of the long-term memory that stores explicit information, basically our fact memory. Um, it has two subdivisions, the episodic memory and also the somatic memory. And declarative memory more often requires conscious mental effort. In other words, you have to think to get this information. I think about episodic memory is just kind of remembering those episodes or events from your personal life. And it stores temporal coding or time tags to identify when the event occurred and the context coding that indicates maybe where it took place. Thus, it acts as our internal diary or the autobiographical memory. So, if you remember maybe a certain Christmas when you were a certain age, this is the part of your long term memory, the episodic, that is going to kind of help you determine how old you were and what was happening around you at that period of time. Whereas the somatic memory is again a little subdivision of declarative memory that stores our general knowledge, the meaning for words and concepts, and it's more like an encyclopedia or a database than an autobiography. This is the stuff that's great when you're playing games like Jeopardy or if you're doing Quiz Bowl. All the facts and concepts that you know are stored here, and as a result, it will register when somebody asks, hey, who was the third president? And you can easily say it was Thomas Jefferson. So, long term memory, two parts: declarative memory, which is the somatic memory, that's memory for language facts, general knowledge, your encyclopedia knowledge, and episodic memory, your memory for your life. The procedural memory is like, the motor skills, remembering how to tie the shoes, how to ride a bike, how to throw a ball. All that's part of long term memory. So, the biological basis of long term memory, this is the search for the engram. This is a biological basis for long term memory, has taken two approaches. It has involved looking for the neural circuitry used by memory in the brain, and it looks on the level of synapse and biochemical changes that are believed to be present, represent or believed to represent the physical memory traces in the nerve cells. So an engram, this is the physical changes in the brain associated with memory. It also is known as the memory trace. Carl Lashy, he searched surgically for engrams by removing portions of rats' brains and later testing the animals to see if they had lost memory for tasks learned prior to their operations. Maybe a little sketch when you talk about trying to do this on humans, but there have been some weird cases, and one is the tragic case of a fellow named HM. A breakthrough came, kind of in this tragic form with a fellow named HM, and HM had lost his ability to form new declarative memories as a result of a blotched brain surgery back in 1953. And new experiences, unfortunately, slipped away before he could actually store them into his long term memory. It's kind of like the movie 50 First Dates, if you've ever seen that. Adam Sandler. Anyway, so needless to say, HM still lives in the nursing home near Boston, where he resides, and he's been there for decades. And his condition is kind of known as anterograde amnesia. This is the inability to form memories for new information, opposed to retrograde amnesia, which involves the inability to remember information previously stored in memory. Anyway, HM's ability to transfer new concepts and experiences from working memory to long term memory is severely impaired. The removal of the hippocampus and the amygdala on both sides of his brain was probably part of this. This was done during a surgery for severe epileptic seizures, from which he suffered when he was a young man. HM is caught in the present moment and fades without being captured by the memory. And hence, his hippocampus and amygdala are crucial for laying down new episodic memories, although they seem to have no role in retrieving old memories. HM does retain the ability to form some procedural memories, even though he cannot lay down new episodic traces. So he might remember how to brush his teeth or how to tie his shoes, but he's going to have a hard time remembering what he had for breakfast. Parts of the brain associated with long term memory. We know that deterioration of the hippocampus accounts for many symptoms of Alzheimer's. Long term memory makes immediate stops in the hippocampus on their way to their final destination in long term storage. And this process is called consolidation. The intermediate hippocampal memories are gradually changed into relatively permanent memories and stored in the cortex. Anywho, consolidation, this is a process by which short-term memories are changed into long-term memories. And the hippocampus's neuroneighbor, the amygdala, has the job of strengthening the memories that have strong emotional associations. These emotional associations, it seems, act as an aid to access and retrieve these memories. So a while back, we talked about emotions and this whole idea that it's really hard to when you're mad to retrieve, memories from when you're really happy, but you could retrieve a ton of memories from when you've been really ticked off before. That's kind of where this comes in. Anyway, the amygdala then is probably the mechanism responsible for troubling memories reported by soldiers who have experienced violent assaults. Hence, they had PTSD. And memories for sensory experiences involve the same parts of the brain used to perceive those experiences in the first place. So, memories, neurons, and synapse. Second to the engram, the second to the engram has concentrated on biology and chemistry of the neurons and their synapse, and long-term memory forms at the synapse as fragile chemical traces that gradually consolidate into more permanent synaptic changes over time. And this explains why a blow to the head or an electric shock to the brain can cause a loss of recent memories that haven't been consolidated. Retrograde amnesia, this is the inability to remember information previously stored in memory, hence the loss of prior memory traces. Certain drugs can interfere with the formation of long term memory. Long term potentiation, when we mentioned in a previous chapter, this is when many thousands, if not millions, of neurons are probably involved in the encoding and storing of a single memory. And this involves use of neurotransmitters and such. Glutamate is an example of that is helping with that processing. So anyway, psychology in your life, the flashbulb memories. Where were you when? We mentioned flashbulb memories and photographic memories. Well, flashbulb memories are just slightly different than photographic memories. This is a clear and vivid long-term memory of an especially meaningful and emotional event. And some flash term or flashbulb memories can be events, so back in 2004, there was a great tsunami that happened right around on Christmas Day, or 9/11, or the Columbine shooting, or you could talk about maybe a tornado that hit your community, or a flood or such. These things allow people to develop flashbulb memories recorded precisely where the individuals were at the time that they received the news, or what they were doing, or what they were feeling emotionally. Flashbulb memories can become distorted, unfortunately, over time. Thank you very much.